In the 1970s, the Dutch city of Groningen faced a transport problem. Like other cities across Europe in the post-World War II era, Groningen was experiencing a steady increase in car ownership and traffic. The last decades had seen a significant rise in car usage, which had led to growing congestion, noise pollution and air quality reduction, since the medieval streets originally designed for pedestrians and carts were ill-suited for large volumes of motor vehicles. This increasing dependence on cars was beginning to take its toll on the quality of life in the city. Public spaces were being sacrificed to make rooms for roads and parking lots at the expense of pedestrians. Despite its compact size and traditionally strong cycling culture, even Groningen had become dominated by cars. The city was at a crossroads, with mounting pressure to either expand its car infrastructure or seek alternative solutions to manage traffic. The turning point came in 1977 when the city implemented a groundbreaking traffic circulation plan, masterminded by a group of forward-thinking city planners and politicians, including Max van den Berg and Mayor Jaap Pop. At the heart of this strategy was a clear division of the city into 4 sectors. Cars were prevented from travelling between these sectors directly and instead were funneled towards the ring road circling the city. It was a design that intentionally made car travel within the city centre inefficient, and boy did it work. By shifting the city's layout to focus on cycling and walking, Groningen created an environment where alternative transportation modes became more convenient than cars. A dramatic cultural and infrastructural shift occurred, with residents quickly embracing cycling. The city invested heavily in bike lanes, pedestrian zones and public spaces, and by the 1980s, bicycle use had skyrocketed. Today, about 60% of all trips in the city are made by bike. The city's embrace of slow mobility had wide-reaching benefits. Local businesses thrived as the downtown became more walkable and appealing to pedestrians, and the quality of life improved as reduced car traffic meant less noise and air pollution. Groningen's success story, though perhaps lesser known, is an invaluable example to urban planners. Its small-scale policies, combined with a commitment to long-term change, show that any city, regardless of its size, can implement a human-centred, sustainable mobility system. Despite this, decarbonisation literature often focuses on car-centric solutions for reducing emissions in the transport sector, such as promoting electric vehicles and improving fuel efficiency, rather than prioritising broader systemic changes. In his book Mobility Language Matters, Marco de Brömmelstroet explains how the language surrounding transportation and urban planning shapes public perception and policy. According to him, our perspective on mobility has become so ingrained in policy, engineering and law that we never stop to question it, hindering our capacity to consider more sustainable transportation alternatives. De Brömmelstroet emphasises how language and metaphors have long been used to make sense of complex systems, despite their inherent flaws. He points out that streets existed long before cars, serving as spaces for trade, socialising and play, and it wasn't really until the 1920s, with the rise of the automobile, that policymakers and manufacturers reshaped the concept of streets to centre around cars, establishing a discourse that has since dominated planning and policy. Like in economics, transport professionals have adopted the Homo economicus theory, which portrays humans as purely rational and self-interested decision-makers who maximise personal utility. The transport system as we know it today appears to be based off this idea that time equals money, with technology and infrastructure developments that prioritise travel time and naturally increasing vehicle speeds. However, the book points to studies suggesting that this assumption often clashes with real human behaviour. Despite the introduction of faster transport modes, travel times have remained relatively constant, indicating that people have a fixed amount of time they're willing to spend travelling. Instead of reducing travel times, increased speeds have simply allowed for longer journeys. Another implication of the time is money metaphor is that it segregates society. By viewing time as a commodity that can be reduced for private gain, high-speed mobility becomes a luxury reserved for those who can afford it. This is evidenced even in the financial measures used to manage traffic, think congestion charges and other urban tolls. De Brömmelstroet illustrates this further with the rise of services like Uber, which have attracted users away from traditional public transport systems. The outcome is a society where people from different backgrounds meet less often. As higher income individuals abandon public transport, demand and investment into these services declines. This leads to route cuts and a worse user experience, creating a vicious cycle that ultimately leaves those who rely on public transport the most at a significant disadvantage. In fact, feedback loops like these exist everywhere when it comes to mobility policy, and many are highlighted in this work. Faster transport means people can access cheaper or better goods and services that may previously have not warranted the extra journey time. Hence, local businesses lose their customer base, and over time, the town centre becomes a less desirable place to live. Think, for example, large retail parks killing the high street. An expansionist approach to congestion management often involves the construction of new roads and motorways. These in turn will attract housing developments, shopping centres, hotels and industrial distribution centres to be built along their length, all of which put more traffic on the road. Rather than congestion being reduced, demand is created. On the podcast Eco-Sophie, De Brömmelstroet indicates the role of congestion as a traffic measure in itself, since it is demand reducing. I spoke about how mobility has driven segregation between socioeconomic groups, but the same is also true for individuals within these groups. He mentions, for example, observations of the relationship between the depedestrianisation of the street and the rise of individualism. Faster transport has enabled people to live further from commercial centres, and is thus in part responsible for the suburbanisation and sprawling cities we see today. And cars, of course, let them travel to and from their home in complete isolation from the outside world. As so much emphasis has been placed on fluidity of movement, it seems to have disregarded the value of confrontation. Fewer are the spontaneous encounters between people on the street, exchanged for a persistent drive to reach a destination as fast as possible. Road rage, to some extent, comes from the isolation of people in their cars and the safe barrier this provides. But also arguably responsible is this created feeling that journey time must be minimised at all costs. Scholars like Professor de Brömmelstroet argue that the real issue isn't cars themselves, but rather how our car-centric transportation system has become normalised. We seem desensitised to the dangers of driving, which many consider the most perilous daily activity. While car safety for occupants has improved, the rise of larger, heavier vehicles raises concerns for pedestrians. Safety was a major concern when cars were first introduced, especially for children involved in accidents. However, responsibility has since shifted more and more from drivers to pedestrians, as society now teaches children road safety, introduces countless traffic signals, and labels pedestrians as jaywalkers if they stray from designated paths. To me, the greatest counter to this critique of our current transport system is the notion of freedom. Cars were first marketed as symbols of personal liberty, allowing people to go where they wanted, when they wanted, to increasingly far destinations. As policymakers strived for efficient traffic management of existing street space, the automotive industry pushed instead for the construction of new spaces, since people should be free to travel on their own accord. Parking meters and road taxes, de Brömmelstroet argues, commoditised car use in a way that further cemented drivers as primary users of the street. This freedom of movement and desire to explore it is to some extent part of our DNA, and something which a large part of society would be unwilling to give up. It would be poorly received, if not against the foundations of a liberal society, to deny people access to private vehicles. Hence, a transition away from this must come instead through an incentivised use of public transport and a critical rethink of urban planning principles. The distinction that in my view is important is that speed of movement does not necessarily equal freedom of movement. A society in which all people have the necessary goods and services within a walking or cycling distance increases their freedom without the need for a fast private vehicle. This is, of course, not a new idea, and recent times have seen a surge in cities implementing policies that promote slow mobility. Perhaps the best example of this is Paris's Vie d'un quart d'heure, or 15-minute city scheme. Introduced by Carlos Moreno, a French Colombian academic, the 15-minute city concept is built around the idea that urban dwellers should be able to access work, education, healthcare, retail and recreation within a 15-minute walk or cycle ride from their homes. Under Mayor Ángel Hidalgo, Paris has become a leading example of this concept in implementation, and as of 2023 has introduced numerous novel solutions. The Les Cours Oasis initiative has transformed around 130 school courtyards into community green spaces, with 42 school and college courtyards alongside 29 nurseries open to the public on Saturdays. Additionally, the Rues aux Écoles programme has led to the traffic calming or pedestrianisation of 201 streets near schools, enhancing safety and accessibility for children. Notably, 56 of these streets now feature new green and public spaces. The city is also pursuing ambitious cycling and walking plans. By 2030, Paris aims to create 100 hectares of pedestrian space and has budgeted €300 million for this initiative. Simultaneously, the Plan Vélo targets the development of over 1,000 kilometres of cycling lanes and 130,000 bike parking spots by 2026, supported by a dedicated budget of €100 million. The overarching goal of the 15-minute city is to reduce social inequalities, enhance urban living conditions, and encourage active modes of transport. Paris's plan emphasises the need for more social diversity, with a target of 40% public housing in Paris by 2035. This includes 30% social and 10% affordable housing, as well as the establishment of 11 new public parks and the planting of 100,000 street trees. The Parisian Pact of Proximity also empowers local governments to implement policies more responsive to neighbourhood needs, fostering a participatory approach to urban planning. That's not to say, though, that schemes like these are without their own flaws. Many valid concerns have been raised regarding whether these initiatives will genuinely enhance quality of life for all residents. For instance, as certain areas become more desirable and accessible, there's a legitimate fear that wealthier residents may drive up property prices, potentially displacing lower-income individuals from their neighbourhoods. Moreover, it's crucial to ensure that local amenities are not only accessible but also capable of meeting the needs of all community members. According to the University College of Estate Management, a reliance on nearby services such as healthcare could lead to overcrowding in areas with high population density, ultimately undermining the very improvements the 15-minute city aims to achieve. And so it becomes evident that implementing slow mobility initiatives demands careful and thorough planning. If executed poorly, there's a danger these initiatives could exacerbate existing social divides rather than bridge them. Evidence of this potential can already be seen in places like Oxford in the UK. According to a BBC article, Oxford became the focus of misinformation after the local council introduced traffic filters, restricting private cars to encourage public transport and cycling. Online discussions falsely linked this scheme to a 15-minute city plan, suggesting a conspiracy to confine people to their neighbourhoods. Despite the council clarifying the separation between the two projects, the confusion led to protests, threats to councillors, and public anxiety. This is a pattern that has emerged globally, as far-right groups and conspiracy theorists have framed transport measures like these as a form of social control rather than a strategy for improving urban living conditions. As I said, I think what proponents of slow mobility are trying to highlight is that cars in themselves are not the issue, rather it's the car-dependent society we've created where everyone feels they must own a vehicle to access what they need. If people want to drive and are willing to support that choice financially, they should be free to do so. However, having a car should not be a prerequisite for accessing the fundamental necessities of a happy, healthy life. Those should be available to everyone, regardless of their mode of transportation. I'd be interested to know what you think about these initiatives in the comments. I'm Luke, and this was The Upshift.